A dry snap of brittle twigs and the shrill cry of a lonesome hawk broke the silence of dawn in Gallatin Valley, Montana. The early light, faint and hesitant, unveiled a rugged land carved by time and hardship. Along a dusty trail that curled past low, weathered sagebrush, Eli Roper rode steadily atop his battered buckboard. His silhouette, lean and stoic in a tattered duster, cut a solitary figure against the endless horizon. Every creak of the buckboard and every clatter of his spurs drummed a quiet testament to a life spent on the unforgiving frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. Eli's eyes, dark and reflective as a stirred puddle in the dry earth, scanned the trail ahead with habitual weariness, one born from years of roaming solitude and quiet regret. He had once been a hopeful young hand, eager to carve his own path in a world ruled by salt and dust. Now, in his mid-30s, his face was etched by the harsh Montana sun and the toll of loneliness that often accompanies a man who rides without a home to return to. In his spare moments, he found solace in repairing fences along the trail, mending what was broken in the land, as though the act of repair could somehow restore a fractured past. On this particular morning, a peculiar sight made his heart pause. As he approached a bend in the trail, a subtle movement caught his eye, a figure huddled against a rocky outcrop, nearly swallowed by the harsh landscape. The sight was as unexpected as a well in the desert. Slowing his pace, Eli dismounted and guided his buckboard aside. He trotted slowly toward the figure, his boots stirring up small puffs of dust mixing with the dew. There, lying prone in the sparse light, was a woman. Her clothes, once perhaps fine, were now torn and smeared with dirt, and patches of bruises marred her skin in stark contrast with the pale glow of early morning. She was collapsing, barely conscious, her head resting awkwardly on one arm as if trying to shield herself from an unseen pain. Shock tightened Eli's chest. He knelt beside her, eyes searching as if he could read the silent agony etched upon her face. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he called gently, voice rough and low in concern. The woman's eyes fluttered open, wide with confusion and pain. For a moment, the world around them faded into a blur of cold wind and drifting dust, and all that remained was the unspoken plea in her gaze, a cry for help that needed no words. Her name, as best as Eli could discern through halting, ragged syllables, was Nell Carver, and as he helped her sit upright, a shiver of unease ran through him. Nell's injuries were deep enough to have almost taken her life, and the signs of abuse, torn fabric, bruised limbs, and the vacant look in her eyes spoke of a cruelty that was hard to fathom on these free, yet lawless, lands. Eli rummaged in his saddlebag and retrieved a small tin box, a modest, weathered collection of his life savings, scarcely more than a few dollars saved over long years on the trail. Every cent in that box was precious, earned through relentless labor and hard bargains, not to mention that it represented the scant hope he allowed himself. Yet as he looked upon Nell's fragile form, he felt something shift deep within him, an ancient call of compassion that refused to be silenced by the echo of isolation. "Ma'am, I'm going to take you to Pine Hollow Ranch," he assured softly, his voice imbued with a resolute warmth. "There's a doctor in town, and I'll spend every coin I've got to get you proper care." Though his words were stated matter-of-factly, they bore the earnest weight of a man who had long been hardened by the trials of the frontier. Struggling to her feet with trembling support from Eli, Nell's eyes glistened with both pain and a dawning recognition, as if, in that moment, she realized that someone had finally come to tend to her wounds. The sparse sound of her labored breathing mingled with the soft rustle of the wind among the sagebrush, composing a fragile symphony of hope in the harsh light of dawn. As they slowly made their way off the lonely trail, the distant landscape seemed to whisper journeys past, of lives forever altered by chance and cruelty. The buckboard creaked under the weight of both man and burden, echoing the collective loneliness of the vast Montana plains. With every step, Eli's determination to save Nell grew, entwined with his own unspoken need for redemption from a life of unyielding solitude. But as they neared a bend in the trail, a shape materialized in the distance, a distant rider, shrouded by the early morning haze. The figure's silhouette was slight yet unmistakable against the soft glow of the rising sun, a silent harbinger that danger might be lurking. A chill, not entirely due to the cold, prickled down Eli's spine as he tightened his grip on Nell's arm, guiding her with care. He wondered if the distant rider carried tidings of ill intent, or simply wandered the lonely trails like him. For a long, heavy moment, the stillness between them stretched out, punctuated only by the rhythmic clopping of distant hooves and the gentle stirring of the wind. In that suspended breath, the uncertain future both was etched into the behavior of the land, a frontier where mercy was rare, and every drop of compassion fought against a tide of cruelty. Eli's eyes, reflecting both determination and quiet sorrow, locked onto the distant figure. "Stay close, Nell. We ain't alone out here," he murmured, his voice carrying a soft warning as much as it did reassurance. Nell's thin lips parted in what might have been gratitude, though the pain of her ordeal still etched her features. As they pressed forward along the winding trail, the silhouette of that rider grew ever fainter, swallowed slowly by the boundless, unforgiving expanse of Gallatin Valley. In that tense instant, every sound, the slap of wind against dry earth, the creak of wood beneath hooves, the soft flutter of broken dreams, wove together into a tapestry of both dread and reluctant hope. And as the first light of day broke over the valley, it became clear that, regardless of the perils they would face, something within Eli had irrevocably changed. That single act of kindness would set in motion a journey neither of them could have foreseen, a journey toward healing, survival, and the unexpected possibility of human connection in a land defined by its harshness and solitude. Thus, with the distant rider disappearing like a ghost in the mist, Eli and Nell continued their slow, uncertain journey toward Pine Hollow Ranch, a place where help, if scarce, might be had, and where the promise of redemption might finally begin to blossom in the cracked earth of the Wild West. A cold wind rattled the buckboard as dusk settled over Gallatin Valley, Montana. The sound of metal creaking against time-worn wooden slats punctuated the heavy silence of the late afternoon, and the low, persistent murmur of the wind carried a bitter promise of change. Riding beside him, Eli Roper kept a steady hand on the reins as he guided his buckboard along the rough trail toward Pine Hollow Ranch, the remote homestead that had long been his only refuge in a land of endless horizons. In the quiet after his desperate rescue on the trail, Eli's guarded eyes now shifted toward a new burden. Nell Carver, the injured woman he had found collapsing by the roadside. Nell sat slumped on the dusty ground at the edge of the trail, her once pristine duster now smeared with dirt and streaked with the chill of hardship. Though barely conscious when he had first discovered her, something in her still had the weight and quiet intensity of survival. With great care, Eli had helped her upright and, using every hard-earned coin in his meager savings, ensured that a traveling doctor could provide her some rudimentary care. Now, as the buckboard rolled creakily along the trail, Nell's eyes, clouded with pain and tempered with defiant resilience, had slowly begun to open. At Pine Hollow Ranch, the sprawling expanse of rugged wilderness met the modest shelter of a creaking cabin, its weathered planks and sagging roof bearing the scars of countless seasons. As the land unfurled around them in the golden glow of dusk, Eli guided the buckboard toward the ranch's entrance, a narrow dirt road bordered by scrubby sagebrush swaying in the gentle wind. Nell, though still silent and distrustful, kept her trembling hand firmly on the side of the buckboard. Her grip was as steady as it was desperate, a silent proclamation that despite her shattered state, she was not yet ready to surrender her will to fate. Tucked close against her heart was a small locket, its surface dulled by time and hardship, a precious keepsake from a past now blurred by memory but not erased. Eli dismounted near the creaking doorway of the cabin. He paused a moment to survey the scene, a simple, unadorned structure that had provided him shelter from the storms of the West. His eyes, lined with worry and hardened by experience, softened as he regarded Nell. "We're here," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "Pine Hollow will have us safe, at least for tonight." Nell's eyes, dark and wary, lingered on his face as if searching for some promise of solace in his rugged features. Inside, the cabin's single room was dimly lit by a few sputtering oil lamps. The air was heavy with the scent of aging wood and lingering smoke, intermingled with a faint odor of herbs that hung about the small table. As Eli helped Nell settle onto a creaking cot, her guarded silence was broken only by the labored sigh of pain and a soft murmur of gratitude that was nearly swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Outside, the vast Montana plain stretched endlessly, a tapestry of dust and rugged rock illuminated by the dying light of day. While preparing a simple meal by a modest fire on the cabin's porch, Eli recalled a memory that had long haunted his quiet nights. He had once lost his younger sister in a terrible barn fire at a neighboring settlement, a calamity that had scorched more than just timber. Her laughter, as vibrant as it had been, was now only a whisper on the wind, lost to a tragedy that had left him with an aching emptiness and a hardened resolve never to let another life go uncherished. The recollection brought a temporary stillness to his weathered features, a brief glimpse of vulnerability that he quickly masked with the steadiness required by his current plight. "I reckon I know what it feels like to lose someone dear," he murmured to himself, his gaze distant as the embers danced. As night deepened, the comforting crackle of the fire mingled with the soft murmur of conversation among the few trusted hands who worked to secure the ranch's perimeter. Nell, though still silent, demonstrated small acts of cautious determination. When asked to help gather firewood from the sheltered outbuildings, she gripped her makeshift walking stick tightly and steadied the buckboard with a firm resolve. Each measured step she took was a silent challenge to the cruelty of her past, her determination shimmering in the flicker of the firelight. But as the last light of dusk faded and a palpable chill set over Pine Hollow, a creeping sense of unease stirred in the stillness. While the ranch was momentarily safe within its creaking walls, a subtle threat came in the form of fresh hoofprints and scattered broken twigs near the far edge of the property. Eli stepped outside and bent down, carefully examining the crisp prints pressed into the soft earth. They were fresh, a stark contrast to the long-ago imprints left by roaming cattle. "They're near," he whispered, his voice low and edged with concern, almost lost in the gentle hiss of the wind. Nell, while tending cautiously to a wound on her arm, turned her attention to the prints. Her dark eyes, though clouded with pain, brightened with a flash of awareness. "Ain't safe out here," she uttered, voice cracking with a mix of caution and defiance. We need to get ourselves settled and prepared." Her words, although few, carried an unmistakable urgency, a reminder that the wild frontier was unyielding, and safety was as fleeting as the fading glow of twilight. Eli nodded silently at her words. Together, they moved to gather the few remnants of tools and supplies already stored near the cabin, a battered flintlock, a piece of rough-hewn wood meant for door reinforcement, and an old, worn rope that had served him well in times past. With deliberate care, he secured the area around the cabin and the buckboard, stoking the fire a bit higher to dispel the encroaching cold and to serve as a beacon of light against the darkening plains. As the campfire's glow spread across the ragged edges of the ranch, the threat remained a silent specter. A faint sound, a distant clip of hoofbeats echoing in the valley, carried on the chill wind, hinting at the possibility of unwanted visitors. The sensation of being watched, of the land itself breathing the menace of incoming danger, was nearly tangible. From his cautious observance by the fire, Eli spotted a solitary rider crossing the open plain, a shadow against the gentle glow of the campfire on a distant ridge. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, perhaps a messenger carrying dire news, or an enemy scout gauging the ranch's defenses. "Reckon we ain't alone," Eli stated in a hushed tone, glancing at Nell with a seriousness that belied his usual stoic demeanor. Her gaze sharpened in response, a mix of fear and resilient defiance threading through her eyes as she gripped the locket around her neck, a small, treasured keepsake that had survived her darkest days. That locket, much like her spirit, was fragile yet unyielding, a symbol of her past, but also a beacon for the future. With the distant rider's silhouette etched against the valley's darkened horizon, A mutual understanding passed silently between them. The night was young, and against the endless backdrop of the Montana plains, time seemed to stretch into eternity. A slow, deliberate waiting for what might come next. The gentle crackle of the campfire, the rustle of wind among the scattered sagebrush, and the soft murmurs of cautious men filled the pause. As they set about reinforcing the immediate perimeter with what little they could muster, a subtle shift in the wind carried the faint sounds of urgency. A series of distant, rapid hoofbeats that grew louder with each passing moment. The tension tightened like a drawn bowstring. In that breathless interlude, amid the interplay of light and shadow on the cold, hard ground of Gallatin Valley, the ranch hand and the rescued woman braced themselves for what was to come. "Keep your wits about you, Nell," Eli said softly, his voice a blend of reassurance and hard-won experience. "We'll manage this together." Her only response was a determined nod, their unspoken vow etched in the moment, and the distant rider's silhouette loomed once more on the horizon. Thus, with the campfire's glow painting flickering patterns on the valley floor and the chill of the impending threat hovering like a specter over Pine Hollow Ranch, the stage was set for the next turning point of their journey, a moment that promised both peril and the slender thread of hope. As the night deepened and the distant sounds of pursuit melded with the valley's eternal song, the uncertain spark of survival lingered in the cold air, a challenge that Eli and Nell would soon have to meet with every ounce of their shared courage. A sharp gust rattled the cabin as night fell, the wind cutting to the cracked glass windows and howling over the Gallatin Valley plains like a vengeful spirit. In the gathering darkness at Pine Hollow Ranch, the cold air seemed to slice through every word left unspoken. Inside the creaking cabin, Eli Roper and Nell Carver braced themselves for what the night might bring. Outside, the silence of twilight was shattered by the ominous sound of approaching hoofbeats, growing louder with every passing minute. The sound was measured and deliberate, a signal that their pursuer was near. Nell's gaze hardened as she clutched the small locket, its silver surface dulled by time, yet still radiant with quiet meaning. That locket, a prized relic from a past life haunted by debt and betrayal, had long been her only talisman. Now, in the encroaching darkness, she secured it tightly around her neck, as though its presence alone could offer protection against the fate she so desperately wished to escape. Eli, standing by the cabin's rough-hewn threshold, peered out into the inky night. His heart pounded steadily, a metronome of memories and resolve. He recalled with painful clarity the night of the great barn fire that had claimed his dear sister years ago. That fire, set by an arsonist whose bitterness had cost him more than he ever imagined, had scorched not only wood and straw, but also the tender hope that had once filled his heart. Now, as he watched the dark trail of hoofprints imprinting fresh tracks in the soft, undisturbed snow, the memory mingled with the looming threat. He wondered if the same ruthless hand had sent this debtor, a dead enforcer, no less, to reclaim what was owed by force. Nell's eyes, shining with a mixture of fear and determination, caught Eli's. "They're coming," she murmured softly, her voice as fragile as a distant whisper yet laden with a fierce resolve of survival. "I've had to run from them, from my past. I was framed for a debt I never owed, chased by a man whose kin set fires that stole lives. I won't be caught again." Her words were clipped, raw, bearing the unmistakable hues of trauma and defiance. In that moment, Nell's gaze, steady and unflinching, was a testament to the resilience that had carried her through so many desolate nights. Eli nodded in agreement, his own features hardening with resolve. "Reckon we must shield these walls or risk losing more than we can bear," he said, his voice low and even. He moved toward a battered wooden chest in the corner of the cabin, retrieving an assortment of crude tools, a tattered hammer, splintered boards, and coils of rope. The tools were relics of better days, but tonight they would serve a new purpose: to fortify the defenses of Pine Hollow and keep the encroaching threat at bay. Working in near silence, the two of them began barricading the doors and windows. Every strike of the hammer, every piece of board jammed tightly against the cold frame, resonated with the weight of unspoken pain and the fierce need to protect what little they had. Between the rhythmic pounding of wood and the distant echo of approaching hooves. Eli's thoughts flared with the memories of that dreadful fire. The searing image of flames devouring the barn, of his sister's anguished cries melding with the roar of the inferno, came unbidden. But with every memory, he steeled himself further, turning his grief into the raw material with which he would build his determination. While Eli worked, Nell moved toward the small window. Her hands, though still marked with bruises, were deft and purposeful. She unlatched the window and carefully peered out, her eyes scanning the ridge and the vast expanse beyond Pine Hollow. In those cold, uncertain moments, she recalled the night she had been relentlessly pursued by a man she now recognized as a dead enforcer, a ruthless individual who had once tainted her reputation and driven her to the very brink of ruin. That enforcer had claimed she owed him a fortune that wasn't hers, and in his pursuit she had come to understand the cruel world of predatory debts in these lawless lands. Her heart squeezed as she saw the glimmer of a rider far off on the ridge, his silhouette faint and barely visible against the moonlit horizon. The sight confirmed her worst fears. The pursuers were nearer than they had hoped to be. "Hold fast," she whispered, voice steady even as the chill pressed against her bones. "I've seen their likeness before. They're not simply out for coin. They're after what they believe is their due." Eli glanced over at her, taking in the determined set of her jaw. "We must be ready," he replied, voice firm. "These men have haunted me before, shadows of an arsonist kin who let a blaze take my sister, and in turn let bitterness swell within their hearts. Tonight, they come with more than just old debts." His words were heavy with history, each syllable a capsule of regret and hardened resolve. As the two secured the final board across the main door, a sudden, sharp sound, a crashing thud, ripped through the cold air. It was as though the very earth had taken a deep breath and exhaled a warning. Their hearts pounded in unison as they exchanged a long, laden look, the unspoken question hanging between them. Would they fend off this resurgent threat, or would the ghost of their past engulf them entirely? Outside, scarcely visible through the haze of blowing snow and the creeping darkness, hoofbeats grew louder as if heralding the arrival of their pursuers. The tension on the frozen ridge was palpable. Every shifting shadow, every whispering gust of wind, carried the promise of impending confrontation. Nell backed away slowly from the window, her hand instinctively grasping the locket dangling from her neck, a keepsake that represented all she had lost and all she still clung to. Inside the cabin, the soft crackle of the makeshift barricade mingled with the steady exhalations of determination from both Eli and Nell. Even as they labored in silence, the external sound of pursuit seeped in, a constant reminder that darkness was closing in from all sides. "They're near," Eli stated firmly, more to himself than anyone else, his eyes never leaving the frozen door that now stood as their only line between safety and the encroaching menace. A moment passed, long enough for the weight of history and present danger to bear down upon them, before a muffled scream, barely audible but laden with urgency and pain, echoed from beyond the ridge. The sound lanced through the night, like a clarion call. Nell's eyes widened with shock and dread, and Eli felt a cold knot of apprehension tighten in his chest. The pursuers were not only near, they were actively closing in and possibly already ensnaring another innocent soul in the cold grip of frontier lawlessness. With a final, determined glance at the tracks outside and the fading echo of that desperate cry, Nell straightened herself. "We must act," she said, voice steady now with resolve. "I can't let them take another life because of what was done to me." Her words, though sparse, carried the fierce urgency of a woman who had waited too long for a chance to reclaim her dignity. Eli, his face weathered but emboldened by her boldness, nodded slowly. "Ain't it the hard truth of these parts?" he murmured. "We hold our ground, or we lose everything. Together, with hearts bound by a shared past of sorrow and the promise of redemption, they prepared to stand. The flicker of the campfire a lone beacon amid the encroaching darkness, as a new chapter of the struggle against a relentless threat was about to begin. As the distant hoofbeats merged with the murmur of the wind and the tense quiet of the cabin, the night deepened further, leaving Eli and Nell to face the ominous unknown with a resolute stare that challenged fate itself. A faint light broke over the ridge as dawn crept in, its pallid hues scattering the last vestiges of night across the frozen plains of Gallatin Valley. The early chill crept into every crevice of Pine Hollow Ranch, where the world seemed momentarily suspended between dream and desperate reality. At that cusp of day, the tense murmur of impending confrontation whispered through the air, a sound both eerie and portentous. Outside the creaking cabin, Eli Roper stood rigid, eyes fixed on the horizon. He had long learned that no quiet dawn ever came without consequence on these unforgiving lands. Today, his gaze was drawn to a dark silhouette that advanced steadily toward the ranch. It was a dead enforcer, an ominous figure whose presence had haunted their precarious peace since the previous night's frantic preparations. This man, whose arrival was heralded by the precise rhythm of his horse's hooves destroying the frozen earth, sought to reclaim a fabricated debt born of a twisted family feud. Inside the cabin, Nell Carver observed the scene from a grim vantage point. Hunched near a frosted window, her dark eyes burned with a mixture of resolve and guarded hope as she clutched the small locket that had become her personal talisman. That locket, its surface engraved with a symbol of burden and survival, had once anchored her to a past marred by betrayal. Tonight, it would serve as both shield and peace offering. Nell had spent the long hours of darkness preparing in silent determination. The fire within her as fierce as the bitter winds outside. The dead enforcer, a gaunt man with a weathered duster clinging to his lean frame, rode into the clearing with deliberate calculation. His features were harsh under the weak light, and his eyes glittered with the cold ambition of a man who believed he was entitled to what he claimed was rightfully his. "You reckon you can hide from us, Roper?" he growled, his voice carrying over the ridge with an icy edge. "That debt, this false claim, has cost my family dearly, and now it's time to settle the score." Eli's jaw tightened instantly at the mention of the debt. A mendacious tale spun out of bitter family rivalry. In a measured tone, he replied, "It's a lie, and a miserable one at that. My dear sister, Clara, lost her life in a fire set by kin of men like you. I won't allow that sorrow to be exploited by scoundrels." His voice, rough and laden with personal grief, resonated as both an accusation and a solemn promise. The mention of Clara, a name whispered in quiet recollection beneath the weight of the solitary nights, hung heavily in the crisp air, a reminder of the destructive passions that had scarred them both. The enforcer's eyes narrowed, yet something in his stance faltered momentarily. "Ain't that a tragic tale?" he managed to sneer, though his tone betrayed a tremor of uncertainty as he scanned the determined features of Nell, who now stepped forward from behind the window with quiet authority. "You dare defy me? Tell me, miss, whence did you come, that you dare meddle in debts not yours?" he challenged, his voice a rasp that cut into the silence. Nell's reply was measured and unyielding. "This debt is nothing more than a fabrication, a bitter lie crafted to keep me cowering in fear. I've been chased, branded with a false claim I never owed, and I will not be intimidated into silence." Her voice, though soft, carried the unspoken weight of countless betrayals, each syllable a testament to her resilience in the face of relentless cruelty. For a moment, the tension hung like a heavy shroud, the only sound a faint, rhythmic creaking of the old cabin's timbers and the distant scuff of hooves. Jed, a steady ally who had joined Eli over those long, hard nights of watchful preparation, emerged from the shadows with his grip tightening on his well-worn lasso. "Stand down, or we'll have none of this negotiation," he called, a low warning that mingled determination with a hint of fear. The enforcer shifted, his eyes darting between Eli's resolute demeanor and Nell's unwavering gaze. Then, as if compelled by some unspoken truth, Nell slowly reached up and unfastened her locket, holding it out for all to see. The delicate metal, tarnished but still gleaming faintly in dawn's first light, became the centerpiece of an unorthodox proposal for peace. "Take this," she said, voice calm yet imbued with a quiet conviction. "Let it stand as a token that I reject the false debt you claim. There is no honor in chasing shadows and lies. Let us settle this without more bloodshed. Her words, simple and unadorned, seemed to slice through the bitter tension. The enforcer's hardened expression wavered as he regarded the locket, a symbol of all that Nell had suffered and the grim resolve that had kept her alive. For a long, suspended moment, the valley held its breath. Then, with a slow, reluctant nod, the enforcer muttered, "Ain't true, but I reckon perhaps there's a piece of truth in brooding over the past." His words were not an outright concession, but they carried the stirrings of something unexpected, a crack in the armor of vengeance. Eli stepped forward, his voice a low rumble underscoring the solemn gravity of the moment. "We're done with these lies," he said. "This debt is a hoax, an old grudge meant to keep you chasing ghosts. We're not afraid, and we won't pay for a past that holds no justice." His declaration, filled with both the lingering pain of lost kin and the fierce determination to reclaim his future, resonated powerfully in the silent clearing. Gradually, the bounty hunters who had gathered in the dark began to withdraw, the anger in their eyes replaced by a dwindling uncertainty. As they retreated, one of them, his voice low and burdened by the corrosive bitterness of legacy, handed over a crumpled note that fell at Eli's feet. It read simply, "We'll watch." The haunting brevity of those words promised that the threat was not over. It would linger like a shadow on the soul of Pine Hollow Ranch. With the immediate danger diffused, Eli and Nell moved to secure the perimeter of the cabin. Outside, Jed and a couple of trusted ranch hands began the steady work of reinforcing the weary structure and mending the broken fence that had borne the scars of previous assaults. In the soft light of early dawn, as the enforcer's fading silhouette merged with the vast expanse of the valley, the act of rebuilding took on a profound significance. Nell's hand lingered on the locket one last time, her gaze deep and reflective. "It means every bit to me," she murmured quietly, "that I hold on to my past, but not let it define my future." Eli nodded, the memory of his lost sister Clara igniting a tempered hope within him. "We'll hold on to what's true," he replied solemnly, "but we'll let the rest burn away." His words, heavy as the weight carried long on the soul of a man who's seen too much sorrow, promised a tentative new beginning. As the sun finally fully broke over the horizon, its rays illuminating the repaired fence and the steady renewal of Pine Hollow Ranch, the air was charged with a silent vow of resilience. In that moment, with the note "We'll watch" clutched in his gloved hand, Eli understood that while the realm of threats might never vanish entirely, the choice to rise above them would define who they were. A final glance over the ridge revealed nothing but the vast, uncertain expanse of Montana. The dead enforcer and his kin had retreated into the darkness, leaving behind the echo of their threats like distant thunder. Yet the promise of their return lingered, a reminder that the frontier was always on the brink of renewed strife. Inside the cabin, as the day warmed ever so slowly, Nell and Eli, together with Jed, prepared to fortify their haven further. They shared a few sparse words, quiet, determined utterances such as "hold fast" and "we stand," that encapsulated their unspoken commitment to survival without surrender. Though the immediate confrontation had been resolved without lethal force, the tension of the lingering threat had not entirely lifted. In the gentle glow of the rebuilding efforts, the couple understood that while they had momentarily won reprieve, the lawless horizon of Gallatin Valley would always harbor shadows of conflict. Yet now, united by shared losses and the promise of redemption, they stood ready to face whatever came next. With the sun climbing higher in a sky that promised both hope and harsh clarity, the fresh day at Pine Hollow Ranch began. The repaired fence and mended security of the cabin were not merely physical. They were symbols of a new beginning, one forged from ashes, memories, and the steadfast refusal to be defined by past hurts. And as voices in the distance hinted at the slow, inevitable return of their unseen foes, Nell and Eli exchanged a determined look in the soft light of morning. Their eyes carried the quiet promise that no matter what threats might come, they would continue forging a future built on resilience, redemption, and the enduring strength found in standing together. Yet, As the day fully broke and the warm glow spread across the valley, an uneasy whisper on the wind revealed that the note's ominous promise was not yet spent, its final words echoing faintly. "We'll watch." The foreboding lingered, a subtle reminder that amidst the hope and rebuilding, danger might once again come to test them all. Frost cracked under boots as dusk bled over the ridge, a brittle orchestra sound that announced the approach of night over Pine Hollow Ranch. In the waning light, the desolate plains of Gallatin Valley in 1885 took on a somber, almost spectral quality. The air was cold and biting, each gust of wind slicing across the frozen earth like a sharpened blade. At the far end of the ridge, the silhouettes of riders emerged dark against the fading sky. It was the dead enforcer and his ragged band, returning at last to claim what they believed was theirs. Eli Roper, now hardened by grief yet tempered by hard-won redemption, stood resolute before the creaking door of the cabin. His duster, stained and wind-beaten, fluttered in the chill as he steadied his gaze on the advancing threat. Beside him, Nell Carver's eyes burned with a fierce determination. The once collapsing woman whom he had rescued on the lonely trail had transformed into a force defined by her own survival. Clutched tightly in her hand was a locket, a small silver relic that had borne witness to her torment and, in recent days, had grown to symbolize her defiance. Tonight, that locket would become the emblem of her resolve to let go of the chains of her past. The riders neared steadily, their hooves grinding against the frozen ground in a rhythmic, foreboding cadence. From the lead of the group, the dead enforcer rode forward, his face a mask of bitter intent. His voice, rough and laden with years of insecurity and loss, broke the tense silence. "You reckon you can hide behind these walls, Roper? That debt is owed, and it's time to settle every last one of it." The words dripped with venom and the bitter echoes of old family feuds. Eli's jaw set firmly as he stepped closer to the door, his eyes flashing with a mix of sorrow and defiance. "That debt, the so-called claim, is nothing more than a lie spun to keep you chasing ghosts. I lost my sister Clara in a fire set by kin who cared nothing for honor. You and your men don't deserve to live on lies," he said, voice low, rough with the weight of past pain. Nell moved to the window, drawing the locket closer as though seeking its quiet comfort. But instead of retreating, she raised her hand with deliberate resolve and called out, "I know these debts have haunted me for years. I was framed, branded by a man with no pride, but his own greed. I stand here not as a victim, but as a survivor." Her voice, though soft, carried the force of someone determined to claim her dignity back. The enforcer's eyes narrowed as he surveyed her. A flicker of uncertainty passed over his scarred visage. "Ain't that a pretty sentiment?" he sneered. "But your troubles run deep, and the past has teeth." His tone wavered suddenly, as if the very mention of old sorrows unsettled him. In a moment of weighted tension, he spoke with a rasp that betrayed his own painful history. "My brother, he died in that same raging storm that took Clara's life." The revelation, raw and unbidden, softened the attacker's harsh features for a beat, as if he too had been haunted by losses he could not shake. The words hung in the cold air, echoing like a lament from a long-forgotten tragedy. In that moment, the enforcer's threat seemed less an assertion of entitlement than the desperate cry of a man lost in his own bitterness. For a long, hushed interval, the valley seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a grunt that signaled reluctant concession, the dead enforcer spurred his horse into a halt. "Maybe this feud's been carried too long," he muttered, barely intelligible, as his men exchanged uncertain glances and began to lower their heads. Seizing the fragile pause, Eli stepped forward, his voice resonating with the raw weight of his memories. "We're not here to squander lives over old lies. We're here to build something true," he declared firmly. His words, imbued with the quiet strength of a man who had lost too much yet still dared to hope, resonated with a handful of bounty men and townsfolk gathered at a distance. In that solemn moment, the enforcer's eyes shifted, caught between the rage of betrayal and the glimmer of remorse. Nell, her grip on the locket unwavering, slowly extended it forward as if offering it as a covenant of peace. "Let this locket be the seal," she said softly, voice clear despite the tremor of emotion. "It holds not just my pain, but the memory of my past, and the hope that I can leave it behind." The locket shimmered in the low light, a small beacon of fragile possibility amid the harsh chill. For several heartbeats, silence reigned, punctuated only by the soft whinny of horses and the distant clatter of hoofbeats. Then the enforcer, his eyes moist and his voice resigned, spoke with a quiet finality. "Ain't no debt worth the sorrow of lost kin. I won't see further blood spilled over this folly. But know this, we're watching. We'll watch and wait." With that, he signaled his men to retreat, and they slowly withdrew into the deepening dusk, leaving behind a discarded scrap of paper carved with the words, "We'll watch." Inside Pine Hollow, the confrontation's echoes ebbed slowly as the threat receded into the chilling embrace of the Montana night. Jed and a few other trusted ranch hands began immediately the work of repairing the battered fence that had borne the scars of earlier clashes. The sound of their labored activity, hammers striking weathered wood, and the soft murmur of reassurances melded with the crackling of the settling fire. Eli, still standing near the door, turned to Nell. "They're going to come back," he said in a low voice, a mixture of sorrow and steely resolve in his tone. "This isn't the end of our troubles. But tonight, we've chosen not to fight with all the bitterness of past." His eyes lingered on the scrap of paper left behind, a grim reminder that their foes were merely biding their time. Nell, with a hint of vulnerability mingled with newfound strength, nodded slowly. "I'm done running from the ghosts that chase me. I won't let their lies define what's left of my life." The passion in her voice was quiet, but it resonated with the determination of someone who had supplied her resilience from a long and troubled past. Outside, the rustle of the wind to the pines and the low murmur of the valley told its own story, a landscape where grief, vengeance, and hope intertwined like the roots of an ancient tree. The enforcer's note, "We'll watch," remained a stark, chilling promise in their minds, a threat that their respite was but temporary. In the soft glow of the campfire that night, as the repaired fence stood symbolically against the dark plains, the inhabitants of Pine Hollow resolved to wait for the inevitable. They fortified their bonds with shared glances and murmurs of determination, knowing that the cost of peace was constant vigilance. As midnight gave way to the first faint blush of dawn, Eli observed the distant horizon. "It's done," he finally murmured, though his voice was tempered by caution. Nell approached him quietly, her eyes reflecting the quiet pride of a woman who had stood her ground. With deliberate care, she removed a locket from around her neck and, in a symbolic act of closure, buried it in a small crevice near the cabin's foundation. "Let it rest," she whispered, her tone imbued with mournful hope, that by offering this piece of her past, she could at last begin to unburden herself of the debts imposed upon her by others. In that silent moment, as the burned remains of old grievances slowly melted into the dawning light, a gentle rustle drifted from the nearby trading post, a sign that the town, too, would rally to rebuild the bonds of community and defy the endless cycle of strife. Thus, with the dead enforcer's threat left echoing in the chill air and the locket's final sacrifice murmured by the wind, a new chapter began at Pine Hollow Ranch. The promise of enduring hardship fused with the quiet determination of a few resilient souls to forge a future not defined by vengeance, but by the steady hope of regeneration and communal strength. In an epilogue set in 1885, beneath a sky eventually cleared of its lingering darkness, Nell and Eli, side by side amid freshly plowed fields, lowered a simple wooden seedling into the rich, dark soil. The act was quiet and unromantic, a shared task that spoke of partnership rather than passion. And together, they labored to plant crops that would someday feed not only bodies, but also wounded hearts longing for the promise of a new beginning.